let's get started. So good morning, good afternoon, everybody, depending on where you are in the world, and thanks for joining us again today. My name is John Tinsley, and at this point, I would typically say I'm the CEO and co-founder of Iconic Translation Machines, but instead, I'm the managing director of Iconic Translation Machines, part of the RWS group. It's obviously quite an exciting recent development for us, of course, but it's not a topic for today, and there's plenty of time to talk about that elsewhere. Today it's all about Neural MT, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak to you again on this webinar. So for those of you who are rejoining us, welcome back, and for those attending again for the first time, you're very welcome also. So after a 1-week delay, I'm happy to deliver this third and final installment in the 3-part webinar series entitled Neural Machine Translation, the Past, the Present, and the Future. In week 1, we took a look at the history of Neural MT. The week before last, we took a detailed look at the topics which researchers and developers have been working on over the last few years. And in today's webinar, The Future, we're going to take a look at the direction in which research is heading. This will be a combination not only of the things that researchers are working on now, but also some predictions of where things are likely to go in the coming years. This is a big risk for me because we all know there's no bigger way to make a fool of yourself than by making predictions on the internet. But let's see how it goes. So before we start, a little bit of housekeeping. As opposed to the previous webinar, I'm going to try to actually keep this one short and sharp. In part 2, I squeezed a lot of information in and didn't really leave a lot of time for questions. So this time, I'm going to try to keep it under 20 minutes and leave some time for Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions on this week's topic or anything else you didn't get to ask over the past 3 weeks, please pop your questions in the chat box. And just to remind you, there's no need to wait until the end of the webinar either. You can put the questions in the chat box as soon as you have them, so that might save us a little bit of time at the end as well. And then after this week's webinar, we'll be making this entire series available online on YouTube. So once you get the link, make sure to share with your colleagues as well if they couldn't attend. So first, briefly, want to give a recap of what we've covered to date. In the first webinar on the past, we looked at the introduction of Neural MT, the initial splash it made in terms of performance, and while that splash was accompanied with a heavy side of hype, there was no doubting that we had a new state of the art. But that being said, there was plenty of room for improvement that would keep researchers and developers occupied. So in the second webinar, we took a look at what researchers have been working on over the last couple of years, and we did this through the prism of our Neural MT weekly blog. There were certain recurring themes such as terminology, multilingual MT, low resource languages, and domain adaptation that were capturing the imagination, but it's safe to say that these aren't solved problems yet, and they're topics that will continue to be investigated, though clearly to different extents. So the question now is which ones will gain the most attention and which topics which we haven't already covered are the ones we're going to be focusing on for the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years. So before we take our own look forward, I want to take a look back at some previous looks forward, if that makes sense, at some previous predictions that were made and see how accurate they were. So in issue 4 of our Neural MT blog, we covered a paper from 2017 by researchers at Johns Hopkins University entitled 6 Challenges for Neural Machine Translation. The challenges they mentioned, you can see here, and they'll sound familiar because we've covered most of them already. Number 1, we have training out of domain data, that's translating out of domain data, that's domain adaptation, the need for a lot of training data, low resource languages again. Number 3, translating rare or unknown words, that's terminology and BPE. Number 4, handling of long sentences, that's an MT staple regardless of the type of MT. No word alignments, that's relevant to, again, terminology, but also projecting things like tags. And lastly, the fact that results are not very interpretable. So these are these inexplicable errors that I referred to previously. So these were pretty spot on, and this was a nice pragmatic piece of work that concluded quite rationally along the same lines that we covered in the first webinar talking about hype. So if you see what it says on the screen there, they said, we showed that despite its recent successes, neural machine translation has still to overcome various challenges, most notably performance, out of domain, and under low resource conditions. We hope that this paper motivates researchers to address these challenges. And I think we can safely say that it did. Again, on the line of predictions, similarly, I gave a talk at SlaterCon in the middle of 2017 and was asked what the prospects for Neural MT were. So I went safe and suggested there would be more research in the short term and that work would continue on many of the things that we've just mentioned already. but also that neural MT in its generic form would become more and more usable. And I think that was borne out as we saw quality improve in online services such as Google Translate. We were a little bit more circumspect looking forward, alluding to new types of hybrid, which you could probably argue the point on. But certainly we have seen many more use cases for neural MT, which I'll touch on later. And definitely there's a lot more clarity about what was previously a mysterious black box than we had before. So where do we go from here? What does the crystal ball say? So the first thing to point out, like I said, is that many of the active topics will continue to be areas of focus in the future. And this very much includes efforts around low resource languages, multilingual MT, perhaps to a lesser extent, domain adaptation. Researchers will also continue to look at language modeling, BERT, pre-trained models. And the reason for this is because these approaches have demonstrated massive value in other NLP tasks, but they've really yet to live up to their potential for machine translation. So it feels like there's still some more gold to be panned there. So what I want to focus on for the rest of this webinar are 3 more recent topics that we believe are trends you should keep an eye on over the next couple of years, because they're likely to evolve and potentially have quite a big impact, not just on translation quality itself, but also on its usability. So let's get into the meat here. The first such topic is what we call context-aware machine translation. So as the name suggests, this is the idea of taking more and more context into account when translating any given sentence with MT. So currently in standard MT models, both neural and otherwise, when we're translating a document, it's done sentence by sentence. Each sentence is translated completely independently of any other sentence that has either previously been translated or is upcoming in the document. So for instance, in the example that you see here, when we're translating sentence number 5, it doesn't matter that it shares words with sentence 4 and earlier. Sentence 5 is translated in absolute isolation. So I guess it might already be apparent the types of issues that this could cause, principally around terminology consistency across the different sentences in a document, and then also translating things like anaphora. So for example, words referring back to earlier words used in the text, things like pronouns like he, she, it, referring to maybe somebody or something that was named already. So when translating sentences one by one, it means it really doesn't matter how a particular word was translated. So for example, even though a word appears in both sentence 4 and the exact same word appears in sentence 5 like this in roughly the same context, it could still be translated differently. We might hope and expect that the MT model will get it consistently, but equally it might not. And similarly, when translating pronouns like he and she and it, we don't necessarily know who or what they're referring to. And this can have implications. So if we give an example here, translating from Spanish into English, if we refer to sus tijeras, which is scissors, we actually don't know if we're referring to his scissors, her scissors, their scissors. Without context, we simply don't know. It's ambiguous without the context. And so that's kind of why this is such an important thing to look at. And believe it or not, this scenario of looking at it sentence by sentence is actually an improvement in neural MT, because neural MT does look at the whole sentence in question. With statistical MT, it regularly only looked at a sliding window of consecutive words in a sentence, and often reverted to word for word translation as well. So the impact that a word at the end of a sentence could have on the word at the beginning of a sentence, so-called long distance dependency, if you think, for example, in German, where you can often have a verb at the end of a sentence, this was rarely, if ever, taken into account. So what's the future trend here? So there are a few ways to describe it, but to simplify it, essentially the idea is that when we're translating sentence 5 here, we take into account that we have previously translated other sentences in the document. So when we're looking at the word government in sentence 5, we can say, hey, in sentence 4 we translated government like this, so maybe we should do it like that again. Or also, hey, look, in sentence 1 we had government too, so maybe we should learn from that. But a question that raises then is how much context we actually take into account. Like you see, for sentence 5, do we just look at how government was translated in sentence 4, or do we also go all the way back to sentence 1? And then there's also the question of, do we even look forward to see what's coming in the sentences later on in the document to see if they might inform things as well? So in research to date on this approach, we've been looking at different windows of context, i.e. how far back we look and how far forward we look. The bigger the window, clearly the more context we have to inform our translations, but also the bigger the overhead in terms of the computational resources and also the speed of the translation. So it becomes a question of a trade-off between the quality of the translation and the performance of the MT as well. So another important question is how much better are the translations when we take this context into account? And this is the tricky one. So far, not that much better, it would appear. In the majority of cases that we've seen in research, looking back doesn't necessarily inform us any better how to translate the sentence at hand. And while it's concluded it could possibly help in some scenarios, like we've just shown here, there's an element of, generally speaking, perhaps it's not worth the effort. But a more interesting approach for the future is to move away from the idea of the sentence as the unit by which we train MT engines totally. So just to be clear, when we train MT engines, we do so on a sentence level. We have documents that are sentence aligned, and so the MT models learn how to translate individual sentences. And now we're talking about maybe taking more sentences into account. But what if we trained the models not to learn on the sentence level, but perhaps more? We could train models on aligned paragraphs at a time, or even at the full document level. So in this way, we wouldn't need to force the documents to look at windows of context when translating. It would actually be inherent into the model itself. So the potential here is really intriguing. There are still challenges around the computational complexity of doing something like this and how long it would take to train. And there's a question of how much context we should actually train on, like to the sentence, the paragraph, the whole document level. So for example, if we have very domain specific or use case specific MT where the documents are all very similar, let's say contracts or something like that, then maybe full document level context could be really valuable. But for a more general engine, maybe it's less so. You'd be kind of overfitting that type of document. But nevertheless, this line of research is active, it's up and coming, and it will grow in popularity over the coming months and years. So this is definitely one to keep an eye on. The next topic here is quality estimation. So this is a really hot topic. Last week, in the absence of this webinar, we had a guest post on our Neural MT blog from Professor Lucia Spezia on this topic. So Professor Spezia is a preeminent authority on quality estimation, having worked on it for many years, first with statistical MT and now with Neural MT. She literally wrote the book on the topic. So I would encourage you to go and look at that post in more detail afterwards, but let me talk a little bit about it here. So by quality estimation, we mean the task of automatically predicting the quality of a text produced by MT without a reference translation or without a human evaluator. So an important distinction to draw before we jump in here is the distinction between quality estimation as an output from the MT itself, so the MT engine saying how good it is, versus quality estimation as a process that takes some MT output and rates it. So essentially an evaluation. The former approach, a quality score coming from the engine, is what we might consider true quality estimation, as opposed to one where the MT is a black box. So that's the one that we're going to focus on here. Firstly, why would we want to do this? And hopefully the answer to that is obvious. Firstly, current approaches to evaluation are either unreliable or expensive, namely things like blue scores, which also require reference translations, or human evaluations, which aren't always easily or readily available, and they have a human cost as well. Secondly, it opens up a lot of new possibilities and potentially makes MT a lot more usable in practice. So for example, if you have a quality estimation score or a QE score coming from an MT engine, you can consider it like a fuzzy match score. So you could set a threshold of a QE score for segments that should be sent for post-editing versus ones that should be held back. It would make workload prediction and cost estimation more accurate. Similarly, it would help users to flag potentially unreliable translations, perhaps for additional review or QA, and also facilitate easier comparisons for different outputs in different MT engines. So I think the benefits are clear and numerous, but of course, doing this is easier said than done. Otherwise, it'll be done already. So there's a lot of work into quality estimation with statistical MT, though primarily in academia. When we saw attempts at productization of quality estimation, the results were about as accurate as the MT output itself. So, you have not 100% MT output, and then an assessment of that that's also not 100%. So it wasn't really practicable to use. So how does it work? So when it was originally proposed, probably in the early 2000s, it was typically framed as a supervised machine learning approach. So you learn from data and you looked at thousands of features from within the MT models themselves. So this would be phrase table scores bidirectionally, language model scores, the length of the sentence, etc., etc. And these models could then be trained to label the output. So you could provide a score from 1 to 100 for a machine translation output, or you could provide like a binary judgment. So say this is good or not good based on some threshold. However, nowadays, like machine translation itself, approaches to QE have moved away from traditional machine learning and have moved towards deeper neural-based approaches. And the excitement in this field comes from the fact that the basic architecture of neural MT engines are very similar to those of neural quality estimation. So with neural MT, we have an encoder-decoder representation, and with neural quality estimation, we have what we call a predictor-estimator approach. Similarly, both approaches are trained on broadly similar types of data. So it begs the question, do we actually even need a separate quality estimation model to be trained, or could it actually be something that was inherent to the MT model itself during training, so that when it would output translations, it would also output them with some level of confidence? The answer here is possibly. And again, that's why this is a future trend. So early results suggest it's a more than worthwhile path to go down, investigating more into quality estimation. We mentioned supervised learning. There may even be unsupervised options, which, while perhaps slightly less reliable than their supervised counterparts, could allow for more rapid implementation of QE systems. A funny caveat that was flagged in early research was that it was shown that even well-trained neural MT models could sometimes be overconfident in their predictions about their own output. So it was kind of like their neural MT is so good, they're kind of cocky about it and think that they're actually better than they are. But nevertheless, in terms of looking into the crystal ball, I think it's a pretty safe prediction to say that this is going to be a big current and future trend. And I think it's not only something that will grab the interest of researchers, but I think commercial developers will also be scrambling to productize this just as soon as it's up to scratch. So last but not least, I touched upon it very briefly earlier, and it's something that has been suggested elsewhere in terms of trends that we're seeing practitioners trend towards, and that is the kind of more use case specific models and applications. And this is not just for machine translation, but also for other steps in content delivery workflows, depending on the industry, on the use case, on the workflow. So while there will always be demands for more data and bigger models, we're increasingly finding that smaller, more targeted machine translation models can be very effective and also very efficient. It's a case of less is more in some instances. So the idea is essentially that with less training data for narrower use cases, training times will be shorter. Thus, we can train deeper and deeper models and try and learn more and more from the data that we have without that big computational overhead. And that can potentially fit a specific type of content very, very well. So if we think about it concretely, rather than a generic MT engine, we could have one specifically for life sciences. But going deeper than that, we could have one specifically for clinical trials. Or further still, we could have one for informed consent letters within clinical trials. So the idea is that a really focused, deep model. This is definitely a trend that you should keep your eye on, because this is a way, especially in practice, MT developers are working towards. And finally, one of the questions we've always asked ourselves at Iconic when thinking about the bigger picture beyond MT is that this content that we're translating, what actually happens to it before it comes to us? And what happens to it after we translate it? And depending on the answer there, is that something that we could automate too? So it's kind of like the idea of the QE model being similar to the MT. The question is, what else can we do while we're at it, while we're translating this document? So a good example to give here is the task of pharmacovigilance. So you see here along the top, these are the typical steps we have in pharmacovigilance: file preparation, translation, entity detection, triage, case creation, quality control, etc. So typically, in doing a lot of this from a machine translation perspective, we learned that typically after we hand off the translation, somebody is going to manually try to identify certain entities and concepts and terms within the document and try to either tag them or extract them. So we asked the question, why can't we have a model that actually does this in parallel, or at least in step with the translation, leveraging a lot of the same information that we're already using? So for example, if we're managing terminology during the MT process, maybe some of those terms are the terms that need to be tagged in the output. So we can actually do that as a byproduct of the machine translation process as well. So there's definitely a lot of food for thought there in terms of what the specific use case and application is and how much of that information we can leverage. So that's definitely another one of the trends to keep an eye on going forward. So at this point, I'm going to leave it there. As with the smaller MT models, less is more. So what we focused on here are just 3 key areas, but we can guarantee you that there will be a lot of activity in those areas over the coming months and years. So I hope you found this insightful to some degree. Hopefully, if you go back as well, it should dovetail well with what we've covered in the first 2 webinars. So I'd highly encourage you to all to subscribe to our Neural MT blog if you haven't already. As I said, it kind of provides you with a weekly snapshot of where we are with MT, where the spotlight is currently shining. So feel free to subscribe at the link below. Aside from that, I want to conclude by saying thank you once again for joining today and over the course of the whole series. So I'm happy to have a quick look here and see if there are any questions I can answer for you too over the next 5 minutes or so. So there's a good question coming in here. It says, talking about the future and translation technology in general, do you foresee the merging of machine translation and translation memories? It seems TMs are about to become a thing of the past or used to train MT systems, maybe. That's a good question. They are kind of complementary technologies, but also to an extent, they're kind of doing the same thing. And I guess this is where quality estimation will be really important, is in actually understanding, where an MT output is more effective than a particular percentage of a fuzzy match. What actually happens in MT a lot already, which you don't necessarily see behind the scenes, particularly in kind of dynamically adapted engines, are that the MT kind of does a TM match already. So for example, when a sentence comes in, the engine will typically do like a search through its training data to see if that full segment existed already. And if it did, it won't actually put it through the decoder. It's actually just going to say, actually, I have that whole sentence in my translation memory. I'm just going to spit that out without actually going through the decoding process. So arguably the MT is doing machine translation, but also 100% matches as well. So I think we're definitely going to see a more tighter integration, perhaps to the point where MT maybe takes precedence in terms of importance over TMs. But that's I don't want to make that concrete a prediction. I think TMs are still very, very valuable, and a lot of organizations get great leverage from TMs, and it cuts out a lot of work. So it's definitely one to keep a look at. So there's another question here. It says, talking about very deeply trained engines, i.e. within a specific industry or even a customer, is this economically viable? So that's a good question. And the answer is, it depends. It depends on who's asking. So for example, with the likes of an online tool like a Google Translate or a Microsoft Translator or Amazon, they're not interested in doing that because that's not viable for them to kind of drill down to the level of a client or the level of a use case. But if you're a language service provider who works on very critical content with a very high value client and quality is of a big concern, then it's kind of a cost benefit. So it might definitely be worth the effort and the economics to go to the effort of building that MT to ensure quality, and then also to improve turnaround times and whatever the case may be. So it will depend. Some content types won't justify it because they're not high value enough, but it will be, I think, use case and content case specific. Another question here, do you think everyone will have a personal MT engine on their computer one day? I'm going to say no, because again, it depends. Not everyone will need a personal MT engine, and it certainly won't be on their computer. It'll probably be in the cloud somewhere anyway. But yeah, I think, you know, the vast majority of people, especially from a consumer perspective, not talking necessarily commercially, they don't need any sort of personalized specific MT engine. They just need that, oh, I just saw some sports news in Marca in Spain and I don't know what it means. I want to pop it through a translator so that I can get a gist for what it means. That's still going to be by far the most prevalent way that MT will be consumed. But perhaps for practitioners in the industry, specifically practitioners who are working on output, that might be the case. But again, I think you'll find, you know, in terms of all of the machine translation that happens today, the vast of all the words that are machine translated, the vast majority of them are not post edited, so you know, they're used as is. So in that case, again, there might not be the need for any sort of kind of individualized MT per se. So there's a big chunk of questions coming in. And, let me see, it's a long one, it'll take too long to read. Well, there's an easy one. At the end of the presentation, can you please tell us when the 3 webinars will be available on YouTube? Yes, so my colleagues have everybody's details who are on the webinar, so you'll be getting an email with links to them just as soon as they are up online. Oh, some long questions that I'm not going to be able to have time to parse, so I'm going to see if I can take one more question just before we wrap up. Similar to a question we had before, so do you think SMT engines will continue to have industrial use cases or companies will transition totally to NMT? Do you see any continued use case for them? Probably not. There might be an argument that in some cases where perhaps lower resource cases that, you know, upfront an SMT engine could be a little bit more robust than a neural engine, but I think that's going to go away with all of the things that I've talked about around being able to do kind of unsupervised training for models, data synthesis, and a lot of the work around low resource languages, multilingual MT. I think for as much as SMT is not completely obsolete yet, I think those developments in the near term will make it pretty obsolete. I might have said before, but at Iconic we haven't trained an SMT engine in over 3 years, and we have a couple of ones in production, but for reasons other than kind of technical quality and things like that. So yeah, I think it's pretty much statistical MT is going to be pretty much a thing of the past. So time is up. I said I wouldn't take any more than 30 minutes, so I'm going to wrap up here. Again, thank you all very much for attending. There's a ton of questions after coming in, so to those of you that we didn't get to, we'll try to drop an email to you afterwards to check off the questions, and you will get an email linking you to the 3 webinars, which will all be made available on YouTube. So spread the word. Make sure you sign up for our Neural MT weekly blog, and then obviously keep an eye on Iconic over the next while, because clearly now as part of the RWS family, there's going to be a lot more exciting developments going on. So thanks very much, everybody, and have a lovely day.